Welcome to Ham and Jam, the World War II British Airborne podcast, hosted by Andy Bryant and Kevin Getz.
Padre Pegg finished his notes, and with Hendrika, he made the rounds to all the rooms in the hotel. Then he, like the men in the artillery positions, began to sing. And as he began to sing Abide With Me, the men just listened. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, God of the helpless, oh, abide with me. And that, my friends, is a passage from Cornelius Ryan's A Bridge Too Far, involving Padre Pegg of the Glider Pilot Regiment. Welcome to another episode of the Ham and Jam podcast. I'm your co-host and number 2 pilot, Kevin Getz, and I can't do this podcast without my good friend, the number 1 pilot, Andy. How you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks.
Fantastic. Are you enjoying your holiday season?
I am indeed, yeah. I haven't had my Christmas tree up since November, but yes, I am indeed.
I will apologize for nothing. Christmas is my favorite time of the year, so I will be guilty as charged that the tree was up shortly after Halloween. So there. So we're going to have a very interesting discussion. We're going to be talking everything Airborne Chaplains, and we cannot think of any better guest than our own Ham and Jam Padre. He is the author of Death and Heroes, Army Chaplains in World War II. Ian Pegg, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for taking time to sit with us in the Horsa and Groom.
Thank you very much, chaps, for inviting me along, and a Merry Christmas to you both.
Oh, thank you. As normally is our custom, we always go around the table. Padre, what are you drinking?
I'm not drinking anything this evening, unfortunately. Got to stay nice and sober to have this lovely discussion with yourselves.
Well, I'm going with a Belgian blonde, Leffe, and my compatriot, I don't even know why I even bother asking, but Annie, what are you drinking?
There aren't many episodes that I have done of this podcast where I haven't been drinking a pint of Guinness. And I have to say that this episode is no exception, because I am indeed drinking a pint of black stuff. But I am thinking of actually getting the Padre a packet of dry roasted peanuts from the bar, because I can't have him sitting there with nothing.
Oh, absolutely. So you're drinking motor oil, Andy? You said you're drinking the black stuff.
Well, you might drink motor oil, but over here we tend to call it Guinness.
Yeah. Ian, thanks again for coming in with us and discussing. It's such an interesting topic. There's niche topics and then there's niche topics, but describe to us what is your journey into this interest with Second World War chaplains? How did it all begin with you?
Well, it's an interesting question, even though I do say so myself. Wandering around a second-hand bookshop, minding your own business, looking for the military section. And I came across a book called Thank You, Padre, Memories of World War II, written by a lady called Joan Clifford. And there was a foreword by the Archbishop of Canterbury in there. It's a very small book. It's 100 pages perhaps long. And I thought, that might be interesting, small read, just get through it. And then once I'd read it, it got me thinking about what makes a man go to war but not take up weapons. What drives him? What belief does he have in his faith that he needs to serve on a battlefield, at times right on the front line, at times giving up his freedom for his fellow soldiers, at times giving up his life? And I wanted to understand a little bit more about who these men were, not so much about the religion, but about who they were as men and what drove them as men to want to serve like that.
So that's your interest in World War II Padres. But how did you get the idea to actually write a book about this subject? And what was the process of your research and writing?
It's one of those things, as you always do, you end up down a rabbit hole of, I've read this book, I want to have a little bit more of a look at what's out there and what other books are there on chaplains. And what you start to realize is that there are some books on individual chaplains and their role in World War II, but there are not many. There are perhaps, well, I own a fair amount, so perhaps 20, 25 books in total on this subject that I am aware of. And there are lots of older books. So started to look into these stories, read some other books. James Holland's book, Brothers in Arms, mentions Reverend Skinner, who's an interesting padre in himself. And then it just goes from there. You do one to another. And I never thought about writing a book. It wasn't even in my vocabulary. It was a case of, in lockdown, we all found we have to give credit to certain podcasts for reigniting our interest. So the We Have Ways of Making You Talk podcast with James Holland and Al Murray. The Old Front Line was another one that for me was really important. And then I started to be a part of this community, and people were researching, a nation coming forward on padres. And then I thought, well, let's see how much I can gather in terms of research. And a lot of the research is you now can do online, but not all of it. And I was lucky enough to speak to the Army Chaplains Museum, the curator down there, and he gave me some information and lists, and there was a few lists online. And I just started to pick off individual chaplains. And then I started to want to know who was the first chaplain that died in World War II? What was the role of chaplains? What did they do that was more than religion? And all these questions, and as somebody who asks questions for a living, all these questions started to form, and then that leads into you writing a little bit, and then that leads into perhaps there's a book in this, and then the next thing you know, you're 12 months into research with you don't know how many books, and reading really dry PhD theses online to try and garner every little bit of knowledge. And don't get me wrong, I'm not somebody who's ever written a thesis. I understand the reason they're written in the way they are, but by it, when you've read 4 or 5 of them, it ain't half hard work. But I'm somebody who asks questions, and it raises topics in my head. And as I went through this research, started to lay it out, and then I thought, I'll speak to 1 or 2 people. I wrote a chapter, see whether I got a chapter in me. And then I was lucky enough to decide to do it, did a few talks around the country on chaplains, and then I thought, well, I'll give this a go. Whether anybody wants to publish it is another matter. And then I was lucky enough to come across a publisher who served as the adjutant to Reverend Skinner later on in his career, who happened to own a publishing company. And all he said to me was, and I don't know if I should admit this, all he said, as long as you include Skinner in the book, I'll publish it. And I was like, right, I'll write a book then. There you go. You've just twisted my arm up my back. You've said you'll publish it. I'll put Skinner in the book because he'd go in anyway. His story is fascinating. He's not an airborne chaplain. And then that leads you on to all the other chaplains and the role they play.
You had just mentioned, Ian, that chaplains are more than religion. So what are the roles that they're fulfilling? I mean, is this more than just Sunday services?
Initially, so at the start of the war starts up, there are only 120 full-time chaplains in 1939 for British Army. And there were an emergency recruitment to get another 400. Very little training, 2 weeks training. These chaplains were plonked in regiments and battalions. Their reception was less than warm at times. People didn't know what to do with them. For the very reason you've mentioned, which is, oh, you're here to give a Sunday service. That's it. You only work on Sundays. What more are you going to do? And chaplains, very much, even though they were given guidance about what their role was, a lot of chaplains ignored that guidance. What you've got to remember about a chaplain is they're there to serve whoever comes to them, no matter what religion you are, no matter what rank you are, be it officer or soldier. It's more than that. Their role is morale. It's looking after the welfare of the soldiers around them. There are stories of chaplains putting on entertainment, boxing matches, even gambling with the soldiers to show them that they were just normal people. What this does is it builds up a trust and a relationship, and then knowing that this chaplain is going to go to war with you, to the front line, that he's not going to shirk his responsibility. And unfortunately, in World War II, they were all male. The first female chaplain was an RAF chaplain in 1946. So the war was all male chaplains. And then when they got on the front line, their role changed again. So not only is it conducting religious services, undertaking burials, it becomes working with doctors and medical aid posts. It becomes giving first aid and giving drugs when they were short. It becomes being a leader of men in battle, which happened a couple of times. In fact, thing that a normal officer would do. But there's the religious bit attached onto that as well.
So in your research, what was the biggest myth surrounding chaplains? And in the course of your research, did you actually get a chance to bust that particular myth?
So I think the myth is they only worked on Sundays. They were only there to do Sunday service and then the other 6 days of the week they did bugger all. Where in reality, the Sunday service was a service that wasn't necessarily on a Sunday. It would be, especially in the battlefield, it would be whenever they could get to do a service. In prisoner of war camps, it would be whatever was required. It's all the other things that they did on the home front, getting soldiers out of jail when they had got over exuberant with their alcohol before they'd gone into war. It was marrying soldiers. Even I have a record of a chaplain giving a soldier enough money to go home and get married before he goes off to war. That comes out of his own pocket. That doesn't come out of anywhere else. But it's that care for his fellow men. It's, as I said before, it's about morale. So the myth of they only work on Sundays was rubbish. They worked probably as hard, if not harder, than most other officers involved, because their role was a 24-hour role. Whenever anyone came to them for solace or concern, they were there to listen. They wouldn't have a base to work from. They had a very lonely role in some ways, that they would be left to travel around a battlefront on their own, visiting soldiers in their trenches and in their foxholes or wherever they were billeted, and serving, getting naffy trucks ready, serving tea, taking cigarettes, whatever was required to make the soldier's life as comfortable as possible. So I think the myth is they only worked on Sundays. That is massively disproven all the way through. There was so much more than that.
Okay, let's jump straight into airborne chaplains. Is this a case of them receiving the same training? In other words, they're going through jump school? Or is this just a case of them, okay, you're going to come in by glider, so we don't have to take up a training spot for somebody who's going to do fighting?
As the chaplain's role developed, chaplains were expected to undertake whatever training or a portion of whatever training the regiment would be undertaking. So they had to pass jump school. They had to pass first aid. They had to pass fitness to some extent. Might not have been as rigorous. And chaplains certainly, there are records of a lot of chaplains tutored in by glider. And it's important to recognise that they were as trained in parachute drops as any of the other regiments would be.
Before we go on to the next question, I'd just like to take a moment to thank our listeners once again for tuning in, and to remind everyone, if you are liking our content, to like, subscribe or follow on whatever platform you're catching this podcast on. As not only does this help to promote the show, but it also helps us get feedback on the sort of topics you like to hear, so please do that. Jumping into the next question, we've spoken about their training, but what sort of equipment would they be bringing with them to carry out their duties? I mean, are they going to be armed? I know some orderlies were carrying pistols, certainly in the Airborne in Normandy. What about chaplains?
Technically, under the Geneva Convention, they're classed as non-combatants, and non-combatants shouldn't carry weapons. But there are instances of chaplains throughout the war at least carrying a sidearm for their own protection. One of the best known chaplains for doing that is not an airborne chaplain. It's a rabbi called Leslie Hardman, who served from D-Day through Holland into Germany, and said that he would need a weapon to protect himself for the obvious reasons the Germans didn't like Jews. There is one record I have of a certain chaplain who, in the part of a retreat that his regiment was under, picked up a Bren gun to cover the retreat. Now, the problem, and we come across this a lot in the research, the problem with that is that's one very small passage in a big piece of research, and I've not been able to corroborate that anywhere else. But it's certainly said very clearly that's what happened. So yeah, some did carry weapons. It was normally their assistants. They would have a batman or an assistant who would help them. Their assistant would be heavily armed to protect them and do whatever was required to make sure the chaplain was okay. In terms of what they carried with them into battle, that would be a normal chaplain stuff, but it would be a very small communion set, a crucifix, a holy book, be it a Bible, or if you're a rabbi, or whatever the rabbi took with them, a stole. They always had the stole round their neck. That would be tucked away in their communion set. And then the normal communion set would have a péton, wine, a water bottle, a cup or a chalice. And that would be it, really. And then they'd just have to look after themselves going into battle. And one of the myths that I would like to prove or disprove and I haven't got to yet is we've all seen The Longest Day with the chaplain in the water. There are certain rumours around that in some ways it did happen, but not quite in that way. And what's bizarre about that film, and just getting off topic a little bit, that's the only reference to a chaplain all the way through the film, is that little comedic bit, I believe. But anyway, yeah. So that's what they took in with them. Communion set, no weapons, and they were there to serve their fellow men.
Yeah. When you were answering that question, Ian, that scene immediately popped into my head, and I could just say, my communion set, I must find my communion set. So in the course of your research, what interesting stories did you find about airborne chaplains that really fascinated you, whether it was Operation Overlord, it was Market Garden or Varsity? Are there any particular stories that really kind of caught your attention or jumped out at you?
I just want to give a few minutes, if you don't mind, to an airborne chaplain called Reverend George Edward Moore Parry, who parachuted in close to Pegasus Bridge, crossed Pegasus Bridge, and was killed in that action. I'd like to tell a little bit about his story because it's really important in terms of it shows the bravery of what a chaplain is and what the men around him thought about him. So Parry was a wiry Welshman. They called him Pissy Percy, the parachuting padre, and he was a little chap. He was well liked by the men, which is really important. The evening of the 5th of June, he undertook a service under the plane's wings before everybody boarded the service. And what's really important is I want to read a passage out. And this is a passage from Richard Todd. Yes, that Richard Todd that went on to be the famous actor who was then a lieutenant in 7th Para. And he says about that service, as the shadows lengthened on Monday, June 5th, the stand to order was given. The last ceremony that day was a drumhead service in the meadow near Fairford Airfield by a popular padre, Captain Parry, known to us all as Pissy Percy, the parachuting padre. Parry was a wiry little Welshman with a nature as fierce as his red hair and a heart and courage to match. Drawn up in a semicircle, 610 men faced inwards towards the padre, who stood on an ammunition box. A more unlikely or piratical congregation could not be imagined. Every man abristle with weapons, his face and hands besmirched with black cream, his helmet on the ground before him, his rifle or Sten gun laid across it. Onward, Christian soldier went well. Abide with me was rather more ragged. It was not easy to sing that in such a setting. Well, what that shows is, for all people say soldiers weren't religious, he had the whole battalion in front of him, listening to every word and hanging on every prayer that came. A little while later, just before he boarded the plane, one of the lieutenants came to him and asked for a private prayer because he was scared he wasn't going to come back. And Parry took his time to take him to one side and talk to him and pray with him and give him the solace that he required before he went into battle. Now, Parry parachuted into Ranville at 1:30 in the morning. The battle for Pegasus was ongoing. He crossed the bridge and entered a medical aid post working with the doctors. And where this suddenly gets sad is the Germans counterattacked and overtook the medical aid post and just indiscriminately started to murder the wounded, bayonet them. Parry didn't stand by. He was there. He jumped in front of those German soldiers to try and save his fellow soldiers and was cut down, basically, for want of a better word, with his fellow soldiers. He is buried with those soldiers that were killed. He's buried with them. I've been to his grave and sat there and had a little think about him. That just shows the bravery of what these men were about. They weren't just about religion. They were about the care and the faith within that. So that's just one of those. And then we come on to the microcosm, as I've been calling it, which is Arnhem. Now, for all the soldiers that dropped to Arnhem, there were 18 British Army chaplains and 3 Polish Army chaplains, all airborne. They didn't all parachute in, some came in by glider, but each of those chaplains has their own story. There were stories of bravery, of death, of escape, cunning, but of prayer and of leadership. I think where I'd like to start with that is one of the most impressive chaplains for me at Arnhem a chaplain called Reverend Watkins. Now, Watkins is interesting because he jumped into Wolfhazen on the 17th of September and he parachuted in, and he had his hands tied up with increasing numbers of wounded. But the following day, he found himself with a lieutenant being the only officers alive with a ragtag group of men around him. And he realised he would have to not only be their chaplain, but also their leader. And what's important in all of that is that as their leader, he was organising the battle. He was setting up battle positions. He was building defensive walls, but he was also, once he'd set those up, taking wounded back into the medical aid posts, dealing with all that pressure. And that went on for 2 or 3 days with him in charge until they were relieved. And it just shows that there was so much more than religion going on. They were officers, and they were officers and leaders of men. And I think that's a really important story to tell. And there are other stories there, bravery and upset. Reverend Benson was a Roman Catholic chaplain who parachuted in early in the Arnhem battle, and whilst dealing with wounded, was hit by a mortar shell, and he was severely injured. He had his left arm effectively blown off, and the reports from other chaplains that were with him was he gave up wanting to live because he thought he couldn't undertake his religious duties with only one arm. And I think that's really sad, because he'd given so much to the men around him. For him to die in that way because he'd just given up actually is really sad. But then there were chaplains that were involved in attempted escapes, trying to swim the river, get their soldiers out, helping people jump off trains and escape, and escaping themselves and being on the run for what effectively was 9 months, hidden away in the Dutch countryside by Dutch people until the war sort of caught up with them further down the line. And that sort of sets out that microcosm of what chaplains did across the whole of World War II, in that you had bravery, you had death, you had leadership, you had been there and dealing with what was in front of you, which is much more than religion. And yeah, there was the burying of people and giving last rites and solace to those that were dying, but it was much more than that.
In general, then, I think you've pretty much answered this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Could you explain from your research whether the frontline soldiers, what they thought of chaplains? Did they feel the chaplains were necessary for morale, or just a body that got in the way?
As their role became more important, they were seen as a friend to all. They were seen as that safe space you could go to when you were worried, when you were really struggling. Their role and value, not just to the soldier on the front line. And what we have to remember, the one consistency of the whole of World War II is whichever battle, wherever the front line was, there was a chaplain on that front line, putting themselves in danger a lot of the times to serve the men around them. And men seeing chaplains doing that and not shirking their duties and being right there with the guns and the bombs going off around them, they were seen as, in some instances, as heroes. People who they could be trusted, who in a crisis they knew you could be relied on. It's really important to recognise that soldiers, even the non-religious soldiers, knew how good a chaplain was through his actions that took place. And the only VC that was won on D-Day, the chap whose name escapes me, and I shouldn't ever forget that, but he wasn't airborne. The only time he broke down was when he got his men back to a regimental aid post and he spoke to the chaplain. He took the chaplain to one side, and that to have that trust from such a great man, that's the person he wanted to speak to. And I think going back to Reverend Parry, how was Reverend Parry viewed? I think what's interesting, he said that he was very popular. One of the officers said, "I was with the men of the battalion during many hours of D-Day, watching their successful battle toward the bridge, and I know how deeply they felt the loss of the man who had dropped with them in the dangerous darkness of the night. I don't think there was a man in the whole battalion who that day did not fight to avenge the death of Padre Parry." And I think that one sentence says it all. They were part of the bigger picture. They were who people relied on. as a friend and as somebody who was there no matter what.
And Ian, as you did this journey, looking into the chaplains and airborne chaplains, what did you come away from this? When you finally piece all of this together, was there anything that you just, it was like this big aha moment that came to you as you finally finished it?
I think the big thing that came out for me, and this starts from a position of not knowing anything about chaplains, not knowing what their role was at all when I started this, to absolute and pure admiration for these men. And it comes back to that initial question that I raised, which is what makes a man go to war and not pick up a weapon, but have complete belief in their faith that they are there to serve their fellow men. And my admiration for these men is unbound. The things that they did, and don't get me wrong, they weren't all perfect. And there were chaplains that got dismissed from service, who weren't suited to serving. They weren't all amazing people. There were certainly, as with any walk of life, any soldiery, you got your bad apples in there. You got chaplains that got dismissed for inappropriate behaviour, for requisitioning goods that weren't theirs, for going missing and just walking away. And there are certainly some very sad stories of chaplains that committed suicide because they felt they weren't good enough to serve. But my admiration on the whole for chaplains really is beyond anything, because it's a group of men. There were only 3,692 of them that served across the whole war. Not all of those served on the front line. 96 lost their lives. Many hundreds of them were captured and made prisoners of war, and deliberately gave up their freedom to serve. As I said, they served on all fronts. There wasn't a battle across World War II they didn't serve on, and that is including the Far East and the atrocities that took place by the Japanese. And I think it awakened something in me about there is goodness in the world, and these men weren't in it for themselves. They were in it for the people. That was what they felt their role was, to make sure that those around them were as cared for as they could be. So I think that for me is the sort of story, I think, for me. And we always regard religion as Christmas. You got to remember, a lot of these men served 6 or 7 Christmases away from home. Their family was their regiment and battalion. They would have had direct contact with their chaplain. And as I said, some soldiers weren't religious, but it was the comfort, the solitude, the friendship, the caring. They knew there was somebody there who cared for them effectively as another family member, and somebody who was caring for them without wanting anything back. That care was given no matter what you thought. And I think that, for me, my admiration for chaplains, just for that in itself, is amazing.
I don't know about you, Andy. I can't think of a better Christmas message right there.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, time is marching on, gents. I'd just like to say thanks again to Ian for joining us on the podcast to talk about a subject which, like a lot of other subjects, isn't normally spoken about. And this is one thing I can say that I love about doing the podcast, the guests and the topics that we've had on sometimes. It's been a learning curve for me, and I'm sure for you, Kev, as well.
Oh, absolutely. It's not something that certainly enters my headspace, but man, that's just an absolute fascinating chat.
It's a nice subject to talk about at Christmas, and it's something that's close to my heart. But thanks for inviting me along. It's been a brilliant chat.
Time, gentlemen, please.
It just remains for me to say thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this special Christmas episode of Ham and Jam. Whatever you're doing this year, we hope you have a safe and happy one. I know Kev's going to get off and get some tinsel around his sporran. But anyway, obviously, we know the Padre hasn't partaken this evening, but Kev, raise your glass. Cheers.
Cheers, and ham and jam.
And a very Merry Christmas.
Thanks for listening to Ham and Jam. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help Andy and Kevin make more, please support them on patreon.com.
And that, listeners, is a page from Cornelius Ryan's A Bridge Too Far. What did we forget?
We didn't toast the episode in.
God is watching. You are being judged.